Please leave a comment where you are watching in the world. Please support us by visiting our new Patreon channel. Link in the description. Enjoy! When I was 10, my parents and I went to visit my grandmother for spring break. My cousin also came to visit, and we decided we wanted to go to the YMCA for the day. My grandmother dropped us off and said she would come and pick us up in 4 hours. On that day, the YMCA was empty. There were a couple of adults in the exercise room, but that's it. We went to the basketball court, and after 2 hours of playing tag and shooting baskets, we were bored. I've never been the biggest fan of swimming, but this YMCA had a pretty cool pool, so we changed into our bathing suits and headed in there. The pool was empty except for the lifeguard. We played a bunch of games and swam laps, but after about an hour, there wasn't much left to do, and there was no one except us to hang out with to keep things interesting. So, we decided to play a game of seeing how long we could hold our breath underwater. We stood in the shallow end near the clock on the wall, so we could time ourselves. Instead of fully submerging, we just stuck our heads face down in the water. We did this a couple of times, and I was winning. On our last round, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I figured it was my cousin giving up and telling me that I won. But instead, it was the lifeguard who told me to knock it off, or she was going to have to ask us to leave the pool. Since we were tired of being in the pool, we figured we would get out, get dressed, and go back to the basketball court until my grandmother picked us up. We only had an hour left anyways, and the water was freezing. As we got out, the lifeguard stopped us and asked if we wanted to go into the sauna to warm up and dry off. The sign said 18 years or older, so of course we were super excited that she allowed us to do that. She walked us to the sauna and unlocked the door. The door was glass, and the interior was made entirely out of wood. Inside, above the door, there was a clock, probably to help make sure you were not in there for an unsafe amount of time. The lifeguard stand was adjacent to the sauna, but if you looked out the door, you could clearly see it. She followed us in and went over to the thermometer encased in plastic and unlocked it so she could crank up the heat. I figured that she must have to turn it on each time, so I didn't think anything of it. Both my cousin and I were very short girls, and so we couldn't see the temperature that was printed on the thermometer knob, but I know she was turning up the heat. Then she left and shut the door behind her. I thought I saw her lock the door too, but I thought to myself, why would she lock the door when we might want to get out? I checked the clock and decided we should get out in 10 or 15 minutes. It was already plenty warm in the sauna, but now the room was blazing. It felt nice because I was so cold from the pool. After about 15 minutes, it was starting to get a little bit too hot, and my cousin agreed that we should leave so we can get dressed. I went to turn the knob on the door, but it wasn't budging. I thought maybe it was jammed, so I shook it, but it still wasn't opening, and then I let my cousin try. She couldn't get it open either. We figured the lifeguard would be back in a couple of minutes, so we sat back down and waited. The room was getting hotter now too, and I really wanted to leave. I got up and started banging on the door and shaking/twisting the knob, trying to get the lifeguard's attention. My cousin got up and joined me. We started screaming at the top of our lungs for her to let us out, but she just stared straight ahead. I don't think there's any way that she couldn't have noticed or heard 2 little girls banging and kicking the door and screaming. Now we had been in there for about 25 minutes. It was so hot in the sauna that it hurt to breathe. It felt like my lungs were on fire. My eyes and skin were burning. We sat back down and put our towels over our heads because they were still a little damp and it made it easier to breathe. I was so worried about my cousin, as she is a couple of years younger than me. I looked at the clock and saw that we had been there for 35 minutes. I got up and walked to the door again and saw the lifeguard still just staring straight ahead. Again, I tried to get her attention by screaming that we needed out and banging on the door as hard as I could, but still nothing. I was starting to get pretty dizzy, so I went to go sit back down, but the wooden seats of the sauna burned my skin. My towel was completely dry, so I put it underneath me to sit on. My hair was also dry, but I wrapped it across my face to cover my nose, and I squinted my eyes so that they didn't burn as bad, but I could still watch if anyone walked past the door. It helped a little bit. My cousin was laying face down with the towel over her head, not moving or saying anything, so I nudged her to make sure that she was still okay. She was, but I could tell that we really needed to get out of there soon because she seemed a bit disoriented. It had been 45 minutes now, and I was extremely nauseous. There was no way that the lifeguard would forget that we were in there, and I thought she would have to come back soon, but there was this little voice in my head telling me that maybe she purposely locked us in there. Finally, a man walked past the door towards the pool, but for some reason, I just couldn't get up. My whole body was on fire, and I felt so dizzy. Luckily, this man wasn't going to the pool. He wanted to be let into the sauna and came back with a lifeguard. I saw them walking this way and immediately jumped up to grab my cousin. I knew now that for sure she had locked us in there because she pulled out her keys to unlock the door and let the man in. I didn't want to take any chances of us being trapped in there any longer, so as the man was trying to walk in, I was trying to shove our way out. As we were going out, the lifeguard started trying to shut the door and push us back with it. The man was clearly confused about what was going on and said, I think they want out. The lifeguard let out a sigh and opened the door fully, and we ran away as fast as we could into the changing room. We only had about 10 minutes before a grandmother was supposed to pick us up. We were both so shaken by what just happened that we didn't say anything to each other as we got dressed or on the car ride home. When we got back to the house, my parents were making us dinner, and I told them the story of what just happened. They thought that I must have been exaggerating, and they didn't believe me. I truly think that that woman was going to let us cook alive in there. The only bit of doubt that I have is what would have happened if we actually died. She obviously would have gotten the blame. What was her endgame? I'm 21 now, but I think about this interaction all the time, and when I'm in small spaces or I get too warm, I still have panic attacks. No one believes this story, and I get it, it's pretty absurd. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to ask for opinions, but do you think that this could have been some crazy misunderstanding, or do you think that she really just left us in there to die? And why? I am from a small town that houses 3 different elementary schools, and only 1 middle school and high school, connected by the gymnasium and a tunnel between the 2 buildings. I had lived there my entire life, and I went to a different school than most other people mentioned in this story. Back when I was in middle school, I had a litany of bullies who loved making every moment of my day a living hell. They did pretty much everything you could think of, ranging from pranks in the middle of class to downright physical assault. But all of them were nothing, compared to this one girl I met at the beginning of 7th grade, whom we're going to call Sadie. Sadie was a stereotypical mean girl in every sense of the word. Loved fashion, had a gaggle of friends willing to do her bidding, and every guy was into her or wanted her. She was the kid with the highest amounts of detentions, argued a lot with teachers, and the principal pretty much did nothing about her actions, and made a habit of having fun with some specific kids, which included me. I was a plus-sized kid, a scaredy cat, gullible, and a bit of a pushover, but I did try to do well in school and kept to myself. But that didn't do much. As soon as Sadie took notice of me, she took it upon herself to make sure every time we even saw each other, she'd make me miserable. At the beginning, it wasn't anything much. She started rumors about me, talked shit about me online. I didn't have social media yet, so I didn't find that out until later, and in school, and threw things at me that ranged from her garbage to one of her textbooks. It wasn't terrible at first. Sadie was annoying, sure, but I had workarounds, so I just ignored her. But when other kids saw that I wasn't going to fight back, they joined in and took things way too far. Almost daily, I have been chased in the halls, ganged up on in the bathrooms, had my food stolen, gotten blamed by the teachers for their dumb actions in class, and many other things. These kids had me on edge and feeling practically worthless for the entire school year, to the point of me considering just running away to avoid the hell of going back to school. Why didn't I tell the school, you may ask? Well, I tried. Dozens of times. Teachers, guidance counselors, even the principal. But they didn't care. The school was honestly not the best, and they were pretty negligent to everything that didn't involve funds, sports events, and GPA for the year. So, they gave no heed to me when I tried to tell them what was going on with Sadie and her lackeys. These are some of their real responses from incidents that happened. When I had gotten my backpack thrown down the stairs, and a calculator inside that I brought from home got broken. Equals, it's your property, your problem. When Sadie had written a fat joke alongside a slur on my locker door in permanent marker. Equals, you have no evidence that it was her. When Sadie's boy toy and his friends cornered me outside the changing rooms for gym to ask me for something, equals, they were probably just kidding around. All of them spearheaded by Sadie, who was practically in charge that year, and nothing she did was getting her into trouble. Summer could not come fast enough that year. By the time 7th grade was over, they let those kids get away with so much. I honestly gave up on trying to get outside help at that point. As I got some personal help that summer, I decided that things would be different by the time I had to go back to school for the following year. I was not going to be Sadie's personal punching bag anymore. When 8th grade started up, I was ready. I learned MMA self-defense, I defended myself vocally, I wasn't so quiet anymore, and I fought back. And it worked. None of the old bullies from last year even looked my way again. Except for Sadie, who still tried to pull her usual stunts. But the longer I showed her I didn't care, the more it pissed her off. Honestly, it felt like ample revenge to all of the shit she put me through last year. Sadie, however, would not let it go for the life of her. I didn't know it then, but this whole act of hers would end up taking a bad turn. One day I was walking to the gym, with Sadie following close behind me. She did not share a gym class with me, but she did like following me around in between classes, and trying to get a rise out of me. This day, however, was not great for me. I don't exactly remember why now, but I was stressed out, and I kept getting pissed off over whatever went wrong that day. Sadie following behind, trying out different insults and comments about me, sent me over the edge. In a quick motion, I stopped walking, spun around, pushed Sadie backwards, and spit towards her, with it landing on her leg. I told her to just fuck off and leave me alone. I didn't know what I was really expecting her reaction to be, but it sure as hell wasn't what she did. Sadie just stood there, frozen, staring at me. I expected her to be coughing up blood from rage, or her screaming, or anything at all. But she just stood there, as if a deer in the headlights. I didn't think about it at the time, as I left for gym not long after, and eventually forgot about it. After school, I was walking across the school building, to head for the parking lot next to the high school building, where I was to catch the bus. Everything felt normal, until I saw Sadie not far behind me. I didn't think anything weird of it, so ignored it and kept walking, until I noticed she was taking the same path I was to the buses. This wouldn't be odd if she actually rode the buses at all. Sadie walked to and from school every single day. If not that, someone would come pick her up. But the carpool lot was in the opposite direction of the buses. I took a different path than my normal route, around the back of the school. I looked back to check, and yep, Sadie was taking the exact same path I was, and she stopped walking every time I looked back at her. I began picking up the pace a bit, and from behind I could hear her running to catch up. By the time I was nearing the bus lot, she was somewhere around 10 feet right behind me, still jogging to follow me. I definitely did not want her to learn which bus was mine, nor did I want her to follow me home, so I decided to fake her out. I jumped onto a different bus, much to the dismay of the driver, and Sadie ran in after me. After she got in front of the bus driver to yell at her about something, I ran off and raced to my actual bus, which was all the way on the other end where this particular bus was. I got in, and the bus drove away just as Sadie got off to see where I went. The next day, I didn't see Sadie anywhere at school. Not in any of the classes, not at lunch, not even after school either. I asked, but nobody knew where she went. This went on for the rest of the week. The bus incident took place on a Monday, and the disappearing act happened on Tuesday. By Thursday, I began to relax about the whole thing. I still didn't understand what Sadie was doing with the whole bus incident, but as long as she was gone, things felt okay. Until Friday afternoon came along. Like the last few days, Sadie wasn't there, so I was pretty relaxed for most of it. When the end of the school day came, I was about to walk out the front doors to the building when something stopped me. I had a horrible feeling in my stomach, telling me not to go outside. I had no idea where that came from, but I thought it was just my leftover anxiety playing tricks on me. So I headed out anyway, not still twisting. The middle school and high school were all a part of one connecting path system, which means we all had hallways and walkways connecting both the main middle school and the main high school buildings, with one long sidewalk path out front. The parking lot where I had to walk to my bus was on the opposite end of this long sidewalk, which ran in front of both the middle school and in front of the high school. This can make for a pretty long walk, and the doors leading into the high school, often flooded with students, make for some interesting obstacles. This would all come into play when this happened. I had just walked down the outside stairs to the sidewalk when I saw someone run around a corner from the building. I looked over and it was Sadie, looking as pissed as a rabid dog, full sprinting right towards me. I bolted, running faster than I ever had in my whole life, running off nothing but pure adrenaline and fear. Sadie was catching up quickly behind me, and all I could do was run and pray for help. I dodged between crowds of kids and just tried that to lose her somewhere in the masses, not caring at all if I bumped into people, only afraid that Sadie was still behind me. By the time I reached the buses, I didn't see her anywhere, so I stopped and nearly collapsed to catch my breath. I felt relief for only a second, until she popped out of nowhere from the side of the crowd and lunged at me. Sadie grabbed me by the hair and backpack, swinging me around in a circle as I tried to get her off me. She kept pulling and jerking so much I felt my hair being ripped at some points, but she kept going. I screamed for help, kicking and punching blindly in Sadie's direction, but either nobody wanted to get involved or were too scared to break us up because there was nobody who came forward. Sadie let go of my hair to reach for something behind her. And what happened next was only a miracle. My older brother was walking out of the high school drinking a soda when he saw the scene and ran to help. He was the only one who knew about Sadie and recognized her when we had gotten to school in the mornings. He threw his soda at Sadie's head, which startled her enough to let me go and drop whatever she was holding. I grabbed my brother and we took off for the bus, making it just before it drove off. After we found a seat, I looked back outside. What I saw still gives me chills. Sadie was on the ground, arms pinned by a teacher, and right on the ground next to her was an open hunting knife. I knew without a doubt that was hers, because of the sound I heard when she dropped it earlier. Next Monday, I got called down to the office where my brother was also waiting. We got pulled into the counselor's office, where there were 2 police officers waiting. Apparently, after we ran, a high school teacher saw Sadie picking up the weapon and apprehended her, while another person called the police. They got Sadie into interrogation, and now they needed to hear what happened from me. I practically broke down right then and there and told them everything. What Sadie did to me last year, what I almost did because of her torment, the bus incident the week prior, and what happened on the sidewalk. My brother put his arm around me while I just sat there, nearly sobbing my words out. The police and the counselor just sat there writing down what I said, but they looked on sympathetically. One of the officers asked me if I would like to tell my parents so they could press charges. At this point I just wanted everything to end about this horrible situation and be done. So I just told them to do whatever they wanted. I just wanted this to stop. The counselor could tell I was already upset enough, so he sent me back to class, and me and my brother made a promise to never speak of this again. Sadie ended up getting into juvie for the rest of the school year, all the way until halfway through second semester of freshman year of high school. The school also had some changes to it too. Police officers were now on duty during school hours in the middle and high schools. We had stricter policies with bullying, and kids could now stay with teachers before / during / after school if they needed to. I never saw Sadie again after that, not even in passing. I later learned from one of her old friends that after senior year, she dropped out to get her GED, because the incident on her police record meant college was impossible. It's been over 9 years since that day on the sidewalk. I will admit, this is honestly not as bad as what other kids probably had to go through, but I still feel the trauma from that time in middle school, and especially from what Sadie did to me. After middle school, I had developed depression, severe social anxiety, and PTSD from the bullies. I can't fully blame the situation for everything, as maybe if I pushed a bit harder with the teachers and the principal, maybe this wouldn't have happened in the first place. But eventually things did end up getting better. I just wish I could go back to my 13-year-old self that had to endure all of that to say that everything was going to be okay. I am doing better now. I am looking into therapy. I am in university right now, and I cannot be prouder of how far I've come. This is something that was super traumatic for me, but it was never discussed again in my household. I was talking with my mom about it the other night, and she still didn't say much. Thought I would share my thoughts with you all. When I was 13, I got a Dell desktop for school. The internet was fairly new for me back in 2003. AOL and MySpace, Yahoo Messenger, AOL chat rooms, 16/f/Cali anyone? AOL chat rooms was where I went. I was a shy, overweight kid back then. Still shy to this day. But online. Online I could be anyone. I could say anything. It was amazing. I discovered so many things when I got the internet. If I could be anyone, so could someone else. Thus how I met one 27-year-old man. One night I logged on. The AOL dial-up sound still makes me feel uneasy. I was sitting in my cold, dark kitchen. The computer was here so I could be monitored. It was just me and my mom though, and she was always working. So no one ever really monitored me. Plus she had no idea how to use a computer, so I got away with a lot. I was bored so I hopped into an AOL chat room. Lurked for a bit, then 15/F here. I was really 13, but saying I was 15 made me feel so much more mature. Private message incoming. Hey, my name is Rob, where you from? And that's how it started. I told him where I was from. That I was in high school. Which wasn't a lie. My school was from 7 to 12th grade. You. 19/M/New York. Oh man, was it cool to be talking to an older guy. And boy was he cute. Honestly, I don't really remember much. Maybe I blanked it out. Maybe my memory is just shot. I do remember emails back and forth. The occasional phone call. I remember finding out he was talking to another girl, and I wanted to break things off, but he begged and pleaded until I caved. Then the let's meet. I was nervous. He had never asked for a pic. Had never really asked for much from me. Just the emails back and forth. A phone call a day. But somehow he made me feel safe. Made me feel wanted. Cared for. He drove from New York to WV one day. My mom worked right beside my house, so he parked about a quarter-mile away and took the back alley to enter my house. My friend was with me when he showed up, but was scared when she seen him and ran out the back door. I maybe should have taken a hint from that, but I just stood on the back porch with my head down. Was given a hug as he led me inside. Not 5 minutes after being there, sitting on the couch, did he move things further. Then further, even into my bedroom. I won't get into the details on what happened next. I assume most can guess. After that he left, with instructions to get in his car after I get off the school bus, and we will go on a date. I had no idea where he was staying. I lived extremely far in the country, an hour's drive from the closest hotel. The next day I get ready for school, ride the bus for the 45-minute drive. And as soon as I hop off in the school parking lot, I get directly into his car. No one noticed. No one said anything. We drive around. Never go on a date. He just finds different places to park so that he can use me. I notice a photo of another young girl 15 or 16 in the visor of his car. Question him. Believe when he tells me it's his cousin. Believe when I question why his hairline is receding so much. Believe him when he tells me I can't see his driver's license because he left it in the hotel. Believed him when he said he loved me. I get dropped back off at school. Super sad that he was going back home. With promises he will call. Again, everything feels very fuzzy. I can't remember many emotions from this time. I do remember that a few days later my mom says she found out I skipped school with a man. That I was never to see him again. And that was that. I do remember sending an email. I do remember a late-night phone call. I do remember saying, I wish I could just live with you. I remember him suggesting to come get me. I remember saying okay. Days later, by the time he made the drive again, I was feeling iffy about leaving my mom. I loved her after all. I didn't think things through. I didn't put much thought into anything really. Packed a few clothes in a suitcase. Forgot all underwear. That is one of my sharpest memories. I felt bad that he drove 8 hours to get me, so I left in the middle of the night. Got in the car to him and his cousin. He got in the back seat with me. Proceeded to have sex with me while his cousin drove. Then get back in the front seat. This happened a few times between my home and his. The drive took forever. I had nothing to drink. Was offered nothing when they got something. They stopped to nap at a rest stop, and I attempted to call my mom, which was disabled on our phone. I dug around for some change to get something to drink, but couldn't afford anything in the convenience store. So I drank out of the truck stop sink. Hours later we park a block away from his house while he runs to get something. I am sitting in the back seat, waking up from a nap when around 8 or so men and women in black suits surround the car, screaming for us to get out with our hands up. My first though *T first 10 minutes in New York, and I am already being robbed. I am terrified. I get out, and a man pulls me over to the curb, while the other officers force his cousin onto the ground. All the while they are asking my name and age, telling me to tell his cousin my age. I am put in the back of an unmarked car, driven to the NYPD. Past reporters, cameras, news trucks. Snuck into the back of the station, where I see Rob in handcuffs for the last time. And for in love 14-year-old me, this is devastating. I am taken into a room and questioned for hours. I am then taken to the hospital. Then a hotel where a nice woman brings me Taco Bell and stays with me as I fall asleep. The next day, 2 FBI officers escort me home on a plane, where I get off and where I am greeted by police officers, my mother, and a horde of news reporters. I later found out that when my mom reported me missing, the police didn't want to do much. They didn't even take the picture of me. She had had his license plate number. She remembers seeing his car parked by the road that first meeting. She took note since it was an out-of-state car, thanks to her being vigilant. I do find this is the only reason I am alive today. The police said they would look into it, but that wasn't enough for my mom. She contacted a family friend, who in turn contacted the governor of WV, who in turn made the police look further into it. After they ran the license number, looked into the man, found out who he was. That was when they issued an Amber Alert, noting that I was in extreme danger. My cousin told my mom that he looked at Rob's rap sheet and it was a mile long, but wouldn't tell my mother what was on it, for fear of scaring her more. I never went to court. I never went to any hearings, but I did fall into a horrible depression. My friends' parents wouldn't let them hang out with me. People spray-painted slut on my locker at school. I had no friends, but most of all I thought a man was in prison for loving me. When I learned he got sentenced to 10 years in prison, which he served every year of, I became deeply troubled. I was in and out of the mental hospital for self-harm for years, on a slew of depression medication. Psychiatrists never talked to me about anything. I had to process it all myself. My teenage years were better though. I transferred schools, made best friends, graduated. But still in the back of my mind I felt that I was the reason a man lost 10 years of his life. Until I was told he was let out of prison. A couple of years after he was out, I contacted him on Facebook. At the time I was around 24 or 25. He told me that if I ever contacted him again, he would kill both me and my mother. That he still knows where I live. I had no idea what he planned to do with me. My mom still says selling me to a sex trafficker. I was told that he had other girls my age he was talking to. Some good things happened because of my kidnapping. Schools all over my state started internet safety education classes. Kids were taught safety. Parents were taught how to keep kids safe. No other girls were taken by this man. So to the man who ruined so many years of my life, I am 29 now. I am happy, healthy, and I have zero remorse that you are now listed as a level 3 sex offender and that you were in prison for so many years. Edit. Thank you everyone who has commented. Thank you everyone who has in turn shared your story with me. I feel less alone. And thank you to the kind strangers who gifted gold and silver. I was very lucky. I was lucky I had a mom who never gave up. I was lucky she raised me. As a single mother, I know it was hard on her. She had to deal with my depression, my anxiety, acting out. She would visit me every single day that I was in the mental hospital as a teen, which totaled about a month at 3 different times. She would work 2 jobs to make sure I had what I needed. Take me after working a 12-hour shift to alternative school because I was kicked out of regular school for self-harm. To all the women and men who have commented that they experienced something similar. Experienced being naive, been taken advantage of, thought that the internet was safe back then. My heart goes out to each and every one of you, but I am also proud of you. Proud that you overcame it, that you are still here today. A lot of people don't understand how intoxicating it can be to have someone older and experienced interested in you. How that feeling of falling prey to someone lingers with you always. I'd like to share with you a series of horrific events from my childhood that we never had a real resolution to. There were some suspects, but no one was ever brought to justice. Also, there have been a lot of terrible things happen on my mom's property, and that's another story, but here's part of the beginning. This part of the story happened roughly around 1990 during my summer break from school, but continued on for quite some time. I must have been about 2nd or 3rd grade age. I grew up with just my mom. My dad was never in the picture, so we lived alone until I was about 12, when she remarried. Our secluded, country neighborhood was safe for the most part, and all of our immediate neighbors were elderly, save for one couple who had a few young adult sons around my brother's age. For the most part, though, didn't have much riffraff in the area. At first, there were only minor clues to indicate something was going on, such as things being moved in the backyard. And I guess because my mother has always been a paranoid conspiracy theorist, she had an idea that something was happening. I didn't really know this until I heard her talking about it much later after the events. She tried to hide things so they wouldn't scare me. She even started sleeping in my room with me at night, probably because she was paranoid, but I assumed it was because we could stay up late and watch movies together and eat snacks. One morning after I got up, I noticed that our old wooden back door had huge chunks missing out of it around the part where the lock/bolt goes into the door frame. It was as if someone was trying to chip away at the locked part. I showed Mom what I had discovered, not realizing why the door was damaged, and she went completely silent, pale-faced, and panicked. I could tell something was wrong, but I was too young to understand that someone had apparently tried to break in, either in the night or when we were out. That day, she mended the door to the best of her ability, and if I remember correctly, she even put a new different lock on it from the hardware store. She also filed a police report, but there was nothing they could do. I had a German shepherd named Munchie. He was a big spoiled baby who loved raiding the fridge with me, but to a stranger, he was probably very intimidating. He was my best friend and very watchful over me, and I still miss him to this day. For a week or two, after Mom and I would go to bed, Munchie would start pacing and whining and acting very anxious. Since we lived in such a rural place with no imminent danger, we thought. Mom would frequently let him outside by himself, so one night, when he was acting exceptionally strange, she let him outside alone. We didn't have central air because our house was old, built in the 50s. We were poor, and Kentucky summers weren't really too hot anyway. At night, Mom would open up all the windows in the house, with the halfway burglar latch, of course. Since she was in my room with me, watching a movie, we had both my bedroom windows all the way up. My back window overlooked a bit of a hill, which gradually sloped into a low, wide bottom. The bottom was full of tall weeds and bushes. Suddenly, we heard movement in the brush of the bottom, Munchie. Then we heard him snarling like a werewolf. Mom got up and ran to the window, but couldn't see anything. What we heard next was horrifying. It sounded as if Munchie was attacking someone. He was making those awful noises, as if he was eating someone alive. I began to cry, terrified that something would happen to my best friend, and my mom started screaming in horror for Munchie to come home. We heard what sounded like someone escape my dog's wrath and take off through the brush. Mom ran to the back door with me right behind her and called for Munchie at the top of her lungs until he came running back into the house. He was panting and grunting and bristled up. I hugged him so tight, I probably nearly squeezed the life out of him. As time progressed, things got worse. Being so young, I didn't know for a long time, but my mom was safeguarding the house. She even moved a tall dresser in front of my window that overlooked the hill and bottom. She tried her best, but whoever was harassing us was finding new ways to make our life hell. Or maybe try to kill us. One night, she said she heard peculiar noises coming from the backyard. I don't necessarily remember this, so I called her for details before writing this. The sounds were coming from under the dining room windows, which overlooked the backyard. She turned on the security light on the back of the house, and saw a ladder propped up against the back of our house, as if someone was trying to climb through our windows. This incident seemed more like an empty threat than a real attempt, especially considering the back door was probably easier access. We don't know if the person thought the windows would be unlocked, or what, but for whatever reason, they gave it a try. Again, she called our local police, and they did nothing. I should probably note that we really didn't have much law enforcement there. You probably wouldn't believe me if I tried to tell you how worthless law enforcement was and still is in that area. On another occasion, and this memory is burned into my brain because it scared me so bad, someone snuck up to my bedroom window one night. I hate to even think what their intentions might have been. Mom had drifted off to sleep, but I was quietly watching the rest of Willy Wonka. I was looking in the direction of my ominous window, the one overlooking the bottom, so I ended up getting a good look at this big, white hand, which reached up and slapped my window screen multiple times in rapid succession. I screamed, Mom woke up, and the tormentor took off, no doubt through the brushy bottom. My mom is a dog person. She adores dogs, and has always had lots of dogs and puppies around. We had 7 little black pups and the mother dog around this time, and they lived outside on our huge property, had plenty of space to play, and a nice, big dog house. At some point around the same time this stuff was happening, we had to be out of town for a few days. Mom had some people watching the house, and I guess she didn't really think anything horrendous would happen. Then again, she wasn't aware of how far this thing would go. When we came home, Mom's puppies had been killed and lined up in a row in the side yard, close to my window that overlooked the bottom. This was devastating. The police did little to help, which included telling her how short to saw off her shotgun so that it was still legal, and advising us to keep Munchie in the house. I forgot to ask, but I'm nearly positive Mom ended up sending the mommy dog away to my sister's house on the other side of town. Months later, incidents were increasing in occurrence, and then someone decided to take it way too far. Something hit the back of the house in the wee hours of the morning. Mom looked out the windows and saw nothing, at least not until the next morning. She found a stick with a charred pine knot on it. Someone had apparently lit it on fire and threw it at our house. I assume they were hoping our house would burn. And don't even ask about the cops, because they did nothing, yet again. I wouldn't be surprised if they knew who the culprit was and didn't care. Then one day, Munchie went missing. He had gone out to the bathroom in the evening before bed, but he didn't come back immediately like always. He vanished. I don't even want to go into detail about this because it breaks my heart all over again, but we found him days later. He had been poisoned. To be completely honest, I could keep going with this story, although it takes a lot of unbelievable turns. Not all of them are horrifying, some are just ridiculous. Then, around 2009, a multiple-year-long court case began where my mom had to fight a group of her neighbors in court to keep them from stealing her property. Those events led us to believe the people involved with that case may have had something to do with the torment we experienced all those years ago, but honestly, all we can do is assume. So tormentor, I wish we could meet, but you're a coward who harasses women and children and hurt animals. This memory of mine begins about 3 years ago when I graduated high school. I had grown up with my grandparents but decided to move to a different, and much larger, city to live with my dad for the first time in 12 years. I somewhat knew the city already because I spent my summers with him, but this would be the first time I would have the freedom of an adult. To come and go as I pleased, drive my car anywhere, smoke cigarettes whenever I wanted. I was excited, though sad to leave all my friends. As soon as I was settled in, my dad and stepmom sat me down to discuss the few rules and what I needed to know about the complex. Basic things like go wherever you want, but let us know when you leave / when you're coming back. Even if it's 2 a.m. Oh, and you'll have to park on the street because the apartment complex has limited parking. One more thing. There's the neighborhood creep. This guy, George, was well known to all the women in the complex as well as the police that patrolled the area. He was tall and fairly huge, very intimidating looking. My parents were pretty certain that he would leave me alone for one reason, my dad. Though George had a habit of stalking other women in the complex, he would stop and find a new target if they had a man make a show of being in their place. A brother, a lover, or a father. It didn't matter what he was to the woman or what he looked like. George would back off immediately. Since I lived with my dad, who was also quite tall and rather big, intimidating, I felt also confident that I would be all right. And I was. For a time. It started about 6 months after I moved in. My stepmom and dad were fighting a lot more until she got up and left him. One night I was sitting on my porch having a cigarette and browsing Facebook or whatever. I wish I could say that I felt like I was being watched, but I probably just looked up because I felt a bug or something. George was standing about 15 feet away, a little bit behind a tree, staring intently at me. I nearly dropped my cigarette. Shakily, I stubbed it out and went inside. I was home alone, so I made sure to lock all my doors and then played a video game in my room. I told myself that I was probably just paranoid. The next morning I got up for my morning cigarette and coffee. Lo and behold, minutes after I got onto my porch, George came ambling out of his apartment to look my way. I sucked down my cigarette and went back inside. This pattern continued for a couple weeks. It was like George stood at his sliding glass door peeking out, waiting to see when I would pop out. I told my dad about it, and he tried to sit with me whenever I went to smoke. If he came with me, George wouldn't even peep a head out of his door. Of course, the other women in the complex have already tried to call police about George. But he lives in the complex and staring isn't a crime, so there wasn't much they could do. I didn't know how far George had taken it with other women before. With that info in my mind, I knew calling wouldn't be much use. Things slowly escalated. Once my stepmom left, I had access to her parking spot. So I had 3 ways to get from my car to my apartment, depending on how I parked. One of the ways went just past George's apartment, about 5 feet from his door. Since I got off work late most nights, I avoided that route as much as possible. Slowly but surely, like he memorized my schedule, he would be on one of the paths when I was coming home. Not directly on the concrete, but a few feet away on the grass. Behind a tree. It was like he thought I couldn't see him. Picture a child hiding very terribly behind a tree. You can see 90% of their body, and you know that they are there. That's how he would do it. I would rush past him, avoid eye contact, but prepare to scream if I heard him come after me. I started to carry my keys between my fingertips. I bought a pocket knife, and I would walk from my car with it halfway open already, even though I've never been in any kind of fight in my life. Around this time, I believe my mom was trying to find me free self-defense classes, since I couldn't afford anything on my tight budget. My dad was steadily getting more and more pissed off as George edged closer and closer to escalating as the days went by. It went from November to May. If my dad wasn't home, I would lock my bedroom door and keep my knife under my pillow. I would Skype all night with my boyfriend, just so someone could call 911 for me if need be. I put a bunch of flower pots in front of my bedroom window, so no one could get in silently, lol. I started sitting on the floor of my porch below the wall out of sight to smoke, but angled so I could see him if he walked up to it. Nightmares of being kidnapped or raped or murdered started to invade my sleep every night. Then one day my neighbor, Shell, was gossiping to me. "Did you hear about George?" "No. He got arrested last night. In the complex parking lot there's a big sort of electrical power box. It stands about waist height and is perhaps 2 or 3 feet wide. About 10 minutes before I was supposed to come home and park right in front of it, some lady with her kid walking by and saw George sitting on the box masturbating. Was he waiting there for me? Jerking off to the thought of me seeing him? Ugh, the thought makes me want to puke and scares me all at the same time. I was relieved for a few days of my stress, but it was only a few days that he was gone. Then he was back, and he went right back to the same OL routine. One night he got far braver. It was maybe 7 p.m. when I went out for a cigarette with my dad. A neighbor walked up to chat with my dad, and George came outside and stood out in the open, staring me down. "Dude's asking to get his fucking ass kicked," my dad said under his breath. Then he chatted to the neighbor some more. I rolled my eyes, went inside, and played some more video games. I was healing in a World of Warcraft dungeon when I heard Shell shouting, "Where are you?" But I was healing, a pretty important job, and I figured she was talking to someone else. Until she burst into my room in a panic, her eyes huge. She hopped from foot to foot frantically, like she was doing the potty dance. "He's bleeding." "Who?" I asked in bewilderment. "Your dad. Come quick." I made some teenager huffing sound and left my computer, certainly pissing off the rest of the group. I grabbed our little first aid kit filled with band-aids. I thought in my mind that my dad was doing something stupid, like tossing up his pocket knife and trying to catch it. But when I stepped outside, I found myself face to face with a real horror. About 6 people surrounded my dad, including Shell, and my neighbor Caleb held a shirt to my dad's side. He was facing away from me, and his entire back was just covered in blood. It looked like he had been mauled by a bear. That was seriously my first thought. I didn't know we had bears in this city. Caleb's hold on the shirt slipped, and blood sprayed. I feel queasy writing this down. I have never in my life been the person people turn to in an emergency. Blood makes me lightheaded, and I have anxiety attacks over not being able to find a specific bookmark. But all of the adults, people around 30 to 40, while I was just 18, around me were panicked aside from Caleb. I needed to be the person that people turned to. I threw the first aid kit onto the porch and told Shell where we keep our towels. She rushed to go grab one. "Has anyone called 911? I shouted. 5 pairs of eyes turned to look at me like they'd never heard of 911 before. "No," my dad said. "I can't afford an ambulance." "Shut up." I said, "What happened?" "That fucker stabbed me." So I dialed 911 and relayed our address and reason for emergency. Operator told us to keep applying pressure to the wound on my father's lower back. My dad is a true champ. Even though the sidewalk was just one big puddle of blood, gross, he stayed on his feet until someone thought to run and get him a chair. I ran back and forth along the walkways to get the police and show them the house that George lived in. And then I ran back and forth to get the paramedics. They were so cold and so agonizingly slow. They walked calmly, and I wanted to scream at them to run. My dad could be bleeding out. Don't you care? I learned later that they don't run because if they let adrenaline kick in, mistakes can happen. They shoved Caleb out of the way because he refused to let go of my dad's wound and got him packed into the ambulance. I was about to jump on when police stopped me and told me that I had to stay so I could give my statement. My dad shouted at me to call his boss, and I remembered all his allergies and whatnot for the paramedics. God, 2 years later, and all these details have been burned into my brain. I gave my statement to the police. Then they made me sit outside the complex on the sidewalk for 2 to 3 hours. They kept me updated on my dad. Once I had called his boss, my boss, and answered my stepmom's message, that's when I allowed myself to break down. It felt like I cried for forever. One of the cops was nice enough to go into my house and grab my cigarettes and a bottle of water for me. He stayed with me the entire time to make sure I didn't run off or something, but he was very nice. He offered to let me sit in his cruiser a few times to get away from the cold. George was waiting in his apartment when they came. When they took him out to where I was, and there were 14 cop cars. 14. He still kept trying to stare at me. I stared right back and felt such hatred that I have never in my life felt. I wanted to go over there and murder him. My babysitting cop looked over and saw that George was staring. so he used his flashlight to keep George from being able to look at me. Once it was all over, I was allowed to go back to my house where I waited for information about my dad. I gathered the story from my neighbors while he was in the hospital for 9 days. He had shouted at George to leave his daughter alone, and George had shouted back at him while I was in the house, totally unaware. George said something along the lines of, "Come tell me that to my face like a man." So my dad hopped over the porch and waltzed up to him. The creep had been waiting with a 12-inch blade held to the side of his leg. He struck out with his empty hand, and then got my dad in the back with the knife. It missed his kidney very, very narrowly, traveled up and punctured his lung and damaged his diaphragm. My dad didn't realize he had been stabbed at first. He got George into a headlock and pummeled the shit out of him, thinking the dude had just punched him in the kidney. George dropped the knife, rolled in the grass, and picked up another knife he had been hiding and stabbed my dad again, this time in the upper back. This wound was much more shallow but still required stitches later. At this point, Shell came outside and screamed to my dad that he was bleeding. He took off his shirt, got pissed, and threw it at George. At that point, the neighborhood stalker put his hands up and went into his apartment. The blood stayed on the pavement until about noon the next day, when my neighbors kindly washed it off for me. I still have pictures in my email of it, as well as my dad's injuries. My dad spent more time in the hospital in critical condition than George spent being held in jail. I feel like it was my fault. I've been addressing that in therapy, but I still feel awful about it all, like my dad had to fight my own battle for me. Throughout the week while I was on my porch, or just outside, I had so many women come up to me. They all told me to thank my dad for them. They had all been terrorized by George at some point, and now they were certain he would be away for good. Several poor women had George stalk them up to their apartment door and pull his pants down, demanding sex. I can't believe the cops couldn't do anything. One of those days, one of my neighbors came up to me to tell me that the police and neighbors had searched the complex and found that George had stashed many knives all over the place, buried in gardens, stuck behind trees, under his doormat. I shudder to think that he might have planned to one day grab one of his targets and do something far more sinister than stare. George was declared guilty for battery with a deadly weapon, but the attempted murder charge was dropped. He was out of prison by Christmas on good behavior or whatever, but my dad and I have a lifelong restraining order against him. He has never tried to come after me, so I can only hope that he's terrified of my dad. I wish I could tell you guys that I took self-defense classes and learned to fight the way my dad can, but I'm still a pussy who can't even slap a spider, so there's that. My dad is doing all right now. He's just had his 3rd surgery on Tuesday, trying to repair the damage done to him internally. We're hoping that this will be his last, and his quality of life will vastly improve. I probably owe my life to my dad. If he hadn't fought George for me, maybe I would have been the first victim George stabbed. I apologize for any spelling or grammatical mistakes. I reread it over once to check, but I'm not perfect. I am in university right now, but staying with my parents at their house for the summer. I was hanging out with one of my friends, and we decided to go to a party. I met this guy around my age. We were talking and having fun, but it was nothing too serious, or so I thought. We exchanged phone numbers. We hung out a couple of times, but he became incredibly clingy right from the start, so I decided to distance myself in the hope that he would get the hint and back off. Well, he didn't. When I stopped responding, he sent me over 100 messages, with each message becoming increasingly more aggressive as time went on. Keep in mind, it had been less than 2 weeks since we first met. I finally responded and told him he needed to chill out. He appeared to calm down a bit after I responded, but he then asked for a phone call. I agreed, and we talked for a while. He told me that he couldn't stop thinking about me, that I was the best thing that ever happened to him, etc., just a bunch of stuff that is way too intense to say to someone you barely know. I tried to let him down gently, reminding him that I was only home for the summer and wasn't looking for anything serious beyond a fling, but this only made him angrier. He started yelling at me, insulting me, calling me a slut, basically a complete 180 from what he had been saying mere minutes ago. Then all of a sudden the phone went silent. After a pause, he said in a quiet voice, "Bitch, you had better get ready because I am coming over for you." And then he hung up the phone. This was very frightening because he knew my parents were out of town for the week and that I was staying at their house alone. However, he didn't know where my parents' house was because I was always the one driving, and he didn't know my friend either, so I thought he had no way of figuring it out. Since, again, I'm normally living at school in another state. Regardless, I locked all the doors and shut the blinds just in case. After a while, maybe an hour or so, I fell asleep. When I woke up, I looked at my phone and saw a notification on my lock screen. It was from the Ring app, indicating there had been movement on my parents' camera. It was him. If you watch the video, you can clearly see something in his hand. When he notices the camera, however, he left. I immediately blocked him on everything and reported the incident. I have no idea what he planned to do once he got here. It was terrifying to realize that he had come over when I was asleep and defenseless and completely unaware of his presence. As I would later find out, he was able to get my address from my phone number. Apparently he Googled it, and it returned my dad's name as the owner of the phone number, along with my parents' address. Since I am on my parents' phone plan, I guess it shows up that I still live here. This revelation was fucking horrifying, as I never knew my phone number could reveal my home address. I am still extremely upset that this kind of private information is on the internet for anyone to find, as it's incredibly dangerous that websites will just give this away to anyone. Please learn from my mistakes, and do not give anyone your phone number unless you trust them. I found out that you can get a free Google Voice number to text and call people, and that number can't be traced back to you so easily. My advice is to use a disposable number for anyone you're talking to that you meet informally or online. I still can't sleep at night. Hopefully this never happens to anyone else. So a little background here. My father was in the Army for 21 years, retired and moved to a very small town in Central Florida. He got bored after a couple of years, and even though we didn't need the money between his retirement and what my mom was making as a bookkeeper/tax prep, he wanted to go back to work. He started working at various gas stations, and it being a small town, the owners wouldn't care if I came there and helped him out with stocking the coolers, or even running the register, as long as I didn't sell any beer or smokes. This all took place in the late 80s and early 90s. The actual story I'm going to tell took place in 1990, and I remember the date well because it was shortly after my birthday, and being 15 in Florida, I had just gotten my learner's permit, and my dad would let me drive him to and from work, just to get some experience on the road, both at day and at night. I was sitting in my usual spot at a table that was set up along the windows, book in hand, feet propped up and empty dew on the table along with some snacks. I would generally spend most of the evening that way, reading books, getting up to run the register/stock the cooler at different times. I remember glancing up because something caught my attention that was unusual, and I realized that a lady was walking up our parking lot from the direction of the interstate. The gas station was right on I-75. This in itself was really strange, because where we were located, you didn't get many people walking, and definitely not walking from the direction of the interstate. I figured she had broken down somewhere, and was coming to use the phone to call for a tow truck or something. I was completely wrong. She came into the store, looked around for a few minutes, and I remember getting just a strange and creepy feeling about her. She walked up to the counter and started telling my dad a story about how she had gotten stranded and needed a ride up to the next big town up north from us. Ocala was the town. This is important. My dad lets her know that he's working, and there is no way that he can take her. She turns and looks at me, and while she is looking away from him, my dad catches my eye and subtly shakes his head no. I was confused for a second, but then she turns back to my dad and points at me, asking if I can take her. My dad responded back that I only had a learner's permit, and wouldn't be able to drive her anywhere and then drive back. Normally, I would have done it, even though it was illegal, because I'd done it a few times before already. I didn't argue with my dad, since this was completely out of character for him. He was normally chatty with the customers, but for whatever reason he was almost curt and dismissive of her. Turns out, he had a bad vibe about her from the minute he had seen her walking up the drive. Well, she cusses him for a minute, and he basically tells her to get out of the store. She slammed the door open. I thought the glass was going to break from how hard she had slammed it, and then she stalks out of the store and down the driveway. I keep an eye on her, and continue to watch as she makes her way back up to the interstate, and then starts up the northbound on-ramp. Almost a year passes, and I'm in my bedroom, less than a week before my 16th birthday. I hear my dad yelling from the living room, "Son, get your ass in here and look at this." I quickly run to the living room and see my dad pointing at the TV, and look at the mugshot of the lady up on the screen, and immediately remember the lady who had been in the store. Turns out I almost gave a car ride to Aileen Wuornos, who was later convicted of being a serial murderer and then later put to death. Still have nightmares about what could have happened. So all ended a couple of months ago, and I only now feel comfortable sharing it. For background, I'm a 24-year-old woman living in Australia and work at an establishment that caters for an adult audience. One night as my shift is coming to a close, one of the patrons asks to buy me a drink, which I accept because employer policy. I talk him up to a couple of expensive drinks for the two of us, have a quick conversation, and make my excuses about my shift being over, but he should come back to see me soon. I feel his gaze undressing me in his mind as he licks the splash of his drink from his upper lip. He stands up and with this creepy grin asks to walk me to my car. Now I'm no idiot. I know never to put myself in that position and politely decline and tell him I might see him next time. I walk out past our biggest bouncer and the guy doesn't follow me. Great. Nothing extraordinary, just standard par for the course in my profession. But sadly this isn't where our story ends. Oh no. For this creep it's only just the beginning. I'm off for a week after that night, but when I come back into work I'm told a patron has been coming in every night for the last week asking for me. Says he wants to buy me another drink. Naively I think, oh great, a bigger pay this week, and get set for my shift. The night rolls on and who should roll in but our man of the hour, and he asks for me right. So I saunter over and he buys me a drink. The whole time I'm sitting there with him, he just has this creepy grin on his face, not like a sexual undressing creep grin. That's just normal. No, this was the kind of grin where he knows something you don't, and is very pleased with himself about that fact. So we're talking and I'm getting him ordering himself drinks and trying to upsell him where I can. About half an hour goes by, and I make my excuses to leave, so I can try to spread the tips around. But this guy isn't having it. He won't let me leave, and the more I insist the angrier he gets. He's practically hissy at me by the time I give a look to one of the bouncers who promptly comes over and defuses the situation, giving me an opportunity to walk away. Phew, crisis averted. Wrong. Bouncer doesn't throw him out, just gives me a buffer, so this guy starts following me around the place, even attempting to walk into an employee-only area, which is where another bouncer finally notices and kicks him out. I finish my shift and walk over to my car. There he is, I shit you not, sitting on the bonnet of my car. How he knew it was my car I will never know. He wants me to give him a ride and tells me how sexy I look. He's spewing greasy slime ball creep lines at this point, and I'm not interested. I try to give him a hint nicely and decline to give him a ride, but again he just turns mean and grabs me by my arm, insisting I give him a ride. I tell him to F off and jam my key in his shoulder as hard as I can. He lets go and I push him with all of my might so he falls down. I jump in my car, lock the door and shove that key in the ignition. He's back up and banging on the window angrily to let him in. And I mean hard, so hard I think his hands or my window might break. I gun the accelerator and I'm out of there. When I get 5 minutes down the road, and am sure I'm not being followed, I pull over to the side of the road and call back to work. I tell them what's happened and alert them that the other girls need to be careful leaving tonight. As I hang up the phone, I break into tears. Now, this isn't my first rodeo. I've been grabbed before, and the sad truth is I probably will be again. But you never get used to it, you know. I eventually compose myself, pull back onto the road and head home. I cry myself to sleep. Next morning word has gotten around. An owner calls me to make sure I'm okay. I assure him I am, but he insists I take some time off in case this creep comes back. He wants to put some distance between us. Makes sense. A week goes by, then 2. He's coming in every night asking about me, and being told I quit and don't work there anymore. A lie to get him to stop coming in, you know. But he just keeps coming in and asking, clearly not buying it, and then suddenly 2.5 weeks and he stops. Great, I am really needing money at this point, so I'm happy to be able to go back to work the following week. Time goes on, and everything seems to go back to normal. Same old chancers, but the good kind that lead to higher paychecks. Abusive guy doesn't come back in, I'm happy. I start being forgetful though. I think I leave a door closed when I leave the house, but it's open when I get back. Lights on or off, food left out. Things ending up in different places than I remember, putting them sometimes moments before. I'm losing it, but it's probably just the stress of everything that's gone down. One of my close friends who works with me reassures me that it's normal after being grabbed like that, and it will pass. This keeps up for a month until one day I head out to work, get 15 minutes down the road, and realize I forgot some clothes I'll need that night at work. I head back home only to find the lights in my front room on, and the TV visible as on from the outside. I really am losing it. Good thing I came back, I guess. I head inside, grab my stuff, make sure to turn the TV off and the light out, and head to the door. Suddenly I freeze. There, standing blocking the door, is the creep that grabbed me. I'm stunned, jaw dropped on the floor. Then, after what seems like a lifetime of standing in silence staring at each other, him smiling that FING smile, I scream, "What the F asterisk asterisk asterisk?" I'm screaming for him to get out and ask him what he's doing here, how he knows where I live, all in one jumbled mouthful of confusion. He just stands there with that smile on his face while I'm loudly freaking out, but stupidly not moving. I start gasping for air in a mixture of panic attack and bewilderment. Then he decides to speak in my wake. The words ooze out of him and leave me chilled. "Welcome home, honey, you're back early." A switch goes off in my head. I throw everything I have on me at him and sprint to the back door. I'm out ski. I leg it faster than I have in my life, screaming bloody murder as I go. No one helps, stupid apathic society. I hide in some bushes around the corner, tears running down my face, gasping for air. I check my pocket, and my keys are still there. No phone, though I threw that at stalker creep along with everything else. I sneak back to my house, jump in my car and nope the F out. I head to work, tell them what's happened, and call the cops. Cops head to my house and send others to my work. Stalker guy is gone when they turn up. They search the house, and turns out he's been living in my crawl space. I'm paranoid. That's what all those doors and lights and misplaced things was about. I pack up whatever I can fit in my car while cops are still there, that they'll let me take, and I drive. Haven't been back since. I moved states, knew everything. When I was 13, the dawning of a new millennium took place on New Year's Eve. While people were fearing the worst with the Y2K bug or out partying and drinking, I was home alone. In 1996, my parents had split up, and from there they divorced, and my mother and I moved across the country from Oregon to Tennessee with her best friend. On the eve of the year 2000, I was home alone, and my mother was currently out of state. Now this didn't worry me, as this was not the first time. I often came home to find a note on the kitchen counter saying they had gone to Florida for a few days and that there were groceries in the fridge. Since the divorce, she was regularly leaving me alone for long periods of time to go to Florida. We lived on a relatively quiet road surrounded by trees and set a few miles out of town, and I knew most of the people, if not by name, then by face enough to wave and small chat with, and had never before been given a reason to be afraid of being alone. On the night in question, I was staying up late watching television. I remember I was watching the movie His Bodyguard on USA Channel, and had most of the lights on in the house, not because I was afraid, but because at 13, I wasn't concerned with electricity bills or saving the environment. I felt completely safe and protected within my little bubble of home. As I was watching the movie, I kept hearing these weird sounds outside, but I remember thinking it was probably the neighbors. Though they weren't extremely close, a couple of them were having a party/people over for the holiday. About halfway into the movie, however, the power in the house suddenly went dead. I sat on the couch for a minute, just sort of in a panic daze, because it was near midnight and pitch black. I remember thinking the power must have gone out and that it would come back on, so I just decided to sit on the couch with my blanket and wait. A few minutes passed by when I heard a noise in the kitchen, where the back door is. My heart started racing in my chest, because I thought it sounded like the back door being shut. The back door sits just off the dining room, which is connected to the kitchen, which leads directly into the living room, where I was currently sitting on the couch. A few seconds passed after I had heard the sound, and I was straining my ears to pick up anything that wasn't supposed to be there. Every noise suddenly felt magnified. When footsteps sounded on the floor, I immediately slithered off the couch onto all fours, crawled around the ottoman, and started as slowly and as quietly as I could make my way toward the space between the love seat and the couch. I knew I could fit under the side table and be completely hidden by the dark and the ottoman, from playing hide-and-go-seek in the dark many, many times with my friends during sleepovers. I was nearly there when the footsteps became more apparent. I knew from the sound of them that whoever it was making their way through the kitchen now toward the living room. They weren't hurried or anything. It was like they were just moving around in the kitchen. I glanced up from where I was crouched on the floor, and to my horror there was a dark silhouette standing in the archway between the two rooms. To my credit, I didn't scream, however I did panic. I stood immediately to my feet from my hiding spot and ran down the hallway, and I believe the only reason I wasn't overcome was because the person chasing me had to get around the ottoman in the dark to follow me. I did what all children do when they're afraid, and I bypassed the front door, the guest bedroom, the bathroom, and ran to the farthest door down the hallway, my room. In all honesty, I probably wouldn't have been able to get the front door unlocked and open in time, as it was right off the side of the couch. When I was 10, I got a bird for my birthday. He was a blue-fronted Amazon, and I named him Boo because it was October and close to Halloween. Boo had a large iron cage. It could have been metal, but very large, sturdy, and like 6 feet tall. And it was kept in my room, despite the fact that Boo, like me, pretty much had the run of the house whenever he wanted. This information will become relevant later in the story. As I ran into the room, I slammed the door shut and locked it. However, the lock was simply one of those little turn knobs that you can easily pop with a butter knife. I had barely gotten the door shut and locked when the person on the other side knocked on it. I have no idea why they knocked, if they did it to mock me or to scare me, but I knew in my heart that my little lock was not going to keep whoever it was on the other side out of my room. It didn't keep my mother out when we were arguing, and it wouldn't stand up to brute force. I was panicking, on the verge of tears when the person started laughing. It was low, quiet, and because of that it was even more frightening. It wasn't like manic laughter, but as if they were genuinely amused. It was the laughter that really frightened me, and I started heavily, hysterically crying and looking around my room to figure out what I could do. That was when I realized Boo's cage would fit almost perfectly between the door and the wall of my closet. The cage moved quietly on my carpeted floor, but as I pushed it into place, it scraped against the door and alerted whoever it was on the other side that I was trying to barricade myself in, because suddenly they threw themselves at my door, and you could hear the sound of the wood splintering and the door handle being twisted violently. Boo, who had been stirred by the movement awake, began literally screaming and flapping his wings. I might have screamed with him, but honestly, I don't remember screaming. I just remember being extremely scared. Terrified, I crawled under my bed/couch, a bunk bed with a futon on the bottom metal, and waited. Several minutes passed, and the person eventually stopped attacking my door. Boo continued screaming even after he had stopped. Though being under my bed gave me no feelings of being secure, I didn't come out from under it because I simply had nowhere else to go. I thought about trying to go out the window, but I was afraid he might expect it and therefore be waiting for me on the other side, and it was also several feet off the ground, as the house was built on a raised foundation. I remember laying under my bed, terrified, for what felt like hours. I must have fallen asleep because I awoke the next morning to daylight. The fear of what happened came back to me as soon as I registered where I was and why, and scared that whoever had been in my house might still be there. I decided to crawl out the window and run to a neighbor since it was daylight outside, and therefore I felt less afraid. Crawling out a window is a lot harder than it looks, and I did it less than gracefully, as I was not, and still am not, the most coordinated human being. Once I was back on my feet, however, I carefully made my way around the house, and that's when I noticed that the back door was wide open. Scared, but feeling braver now that I was outside and that it was morning instead of a pitch-black night, I walked up the back steps and peered inside. Seeing nothing out of the ordinary, no terrifying man leering at me basically, I decided to go inside. Looking back, I cringe on how stupid this could have turned out, and that I wish I could have told my younger self to make the smarter move and just go get help, but thankfully, no one was inside the house. I did a terrifying, heart-pounding room-to-room check, looking in closets and under beds, behind the couch, anywhere I thought even a small child might be able to fit. I even popped the lock on my mom's bedroom so I could check it, and then relocked it afterwards. When I was positive there was no one there, I went back to lock the back door. I had left it open in case I needed to escape, and noticed that the breaker box on the opposite wall was open. The main switch had been pulled. I flipped it back on, locked both locks on the back door, checked all the windows and front door, and then called my mom, where I once again broke down crying hysterically. She called a coworker, who came and stayed the entire day with me as they drove back. My mom still took random trips to Florida after that, but I always went with her from then on forward. So terrifying, laughing crazy person that broke into my house on New Year's Eve, please let's never meet again. I sincerely hope no other young girl had to meet you either. I don't know if you were just some drunk visitor of a neighbor, but you terrorized me that night. I was afraid of being alone when my mom was working, and to this day I still get scared when I am home alone, overthink what I would do if someone came inside, and where I would hide. When my cats make noise out of nowhere, I immediately investigate for fear it's someone trying to get in. My mom had to help lift me back into my bedroom window so I could move Boo's cage out of the corner between my bedroom door and closet. We never had another incident at the house, and we moved in town to an apartment a year later. This happened a few years ago, when I was around 20 or so. I was hanging out with my buddy Matt at my apartment, located in the downtown area of a medium-sized Midwestern city. We were drinking whiskey, watching comedies, playing tunes, etc. He mentions that he has a close friend, Emily, who used to live in my apartment building with her mother. She now lives across the street from me, and he thought it would be a swell idea if we met because apparently we are very similar and I was single and ready to mingle at that point in my life. He rings her cell and tells her to come by my place. She arrived at my apartment and I instantly became fond of her. She was hilarious, very pretty, and a musician just like me. She was around 30, so 10 years older than me. My friend Matt was 35. I've always had friends that are much older for some reason. We played songs together and laughed hysterically for hours. Matt decided to go home, leaving us two alone. We chilled for a while longer, ended up making out, and I got all of her contact info before she told me she's going home and that we should meet up soon. Over the next few weeks we develop a strong relationship, and we hang out almost daily. I would throw some pajamas on and walk across the street, and we'd get wasted and watch movies. It was awesome. After arriving home from my 10-day trip to NYC, things got really weird. The day I returned she asked if she could come over, so I unpacked my shit and then told her to stop by. She rings the buzzer, takes the elevator 7 floors up to my apartment, and lets herself in. I was talking non-stop about all of the awesome things I did and people I met in NYC, and I could immediately tell she didn't want to hear any of it. She would change the subject every time I brought it up, and eventually she said, "Can you stop talking about New York? I really don't give a f******. I was surprised to hear her speak like this. The Emily I had been getting to know was not like this. She was caring and passionate and an amazing person. So I thought. Fast forward to a few nights later. I had just gotten home from working a 12-hour shift, and I collapse in bed, ready to pass out for the night. It's about 9 p.m., and I get a text from Emily that says, "Hey, what's up?" I don't feel much like replying at the moment. I am too exhausted, and our last hangout was too weird for me to comprehend, so I am still trying to decide how to deal with that. I plug my phone into charge, turn the lights off, and fall asleep effortlessly. Bang! 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 I wake up to somebody pounding on my door and screaming at the top of their lungs. "Open the *****ing door. Let me in. Now!" My entire apartment reeks like cigarette smoke. I grab my phone from beside my bed, my heart beating 1,000,000 miles per hour. 27 missed phone calls, a bunch of text messages, all from Emily. I scan through the texts while she's still at the door screaming, trying to break my door down. The most recent text from her is a long one claiming I'm a piece of shit for not responding to her text earlier, and that she's coming over to beat the shit out of me for not doing so. She had a key to the building still, from when she used to live there. I get out of bed, nearly having a panic attack, and try to decide what my next move should be. Should I open the door and calm her? Should I call the police? Should I just ignore her? I decide to open the door. She begins wailing on me, swinging her arms trying to hit me. She was smoking a cigarette, and there were 3 cigarette butts on the ground next to her. Smoking indoors was prohibited in my apartment building. She was very obviously on some sort of drug. She kept screaming at me, telling me how awful I am for not responding to her text message, slurring her speech and losing her balance. I was somehow able to calm her down, and I took her to the roof of the apartment building, which had a pretty nice little enclosed picnic table area. We sat beside one another. She was quiet now, finally. She kept asking me how I could be such an asshole, and that I need to explain myself. The look in her eyes was pure evil as she spoke to me in a calm demeanor now. I said to her, "Emily, I don't ever want to speak to you again after tonight. This whole scenario is absolutely insane. You need help. Let me walk you home." I take her home and return to my apartment to attempt sleeping, at which I do not succeed. A couple days later I return home from work, and there is an envelope taped to my door. I open it, and it's a handwritten letter from Emily apologizing, and saying that I'm a beautiful human, who doesn't deserve an evil person like her in their life. There was a literal candy bar attached to the envelope, one that I had never heard of that she always told me I needed to try. I never spoke to her again. From what Matt tells me, which, by the way, he always knew she was a problematic person, she is a heavy user of crack now and is working as a food runner in a restaurant nearby. I currently work at a restaurant somewhere in the Midwest. Now obviously I can't say what restaurant, but it's on a pretty busy road, with lots of cars, and lots of people walking on the road to get to the bus stop or whatever their destination may be. It's got its own parking lot, where I usually will park closer to the doors, but the story I'm about to tell is the one time I didn't. That night, I sincerely regret my actions. To give some backstory, a couple of years ago, I just so happened to work at the sports bar and grill directly across the parking lot from my current job. I worked there for just 4 months, and I have plenty of interesting stories about that place, but that's for another post. Anyways, while I worked at my previous job, I did not have a car, so I either walked to and from work or I got a ride. Now mind you, I would walk home at around 10 some nights, on a barely lit road when cars weren't always around. This naturally made me weary, and this was on top of the fact that older men would constantly hit on me as a minor and make me feel watched. This backstory of my old job might not seem important at the moment, and I didn't think it would ever become relevant again, but it matters in the end, I promise. While working at my old job, I was a minor, as previously stated, but that never stopped drunken men from approaching me and being inappropriate. There was one man in particular who I never forgot about, and who came back to haunt me in the worst way. The man was taller, quite good-looking, and always wore expensive-looking clothing and accessories. He had a very elegant vibe to him, which is why I did not think much of him when he would talk to me while I was working. He started out very polite. He'd ask about how work was going, how my day was, stuff like that. But as the weeks went on, he would ask more and more personal questions, which started making me suspicious of him. The event that occurred right before I quit was a night I wish I could forget when thinking back on my days at that sports bar. I remember it being a long night, probably because it was a sports season and our restaurant would get very busy, and as a hostess, it was stressful trying to take calls when there was shouting because the hockey team won a golden cup or whatnot. That night, after I had finished cleaning the bathrooms, I remember him being at the hostess stand waiting for me. I approached him and tried to make polite conversation, but I could tell immediately that he was acting strange. His gaze was shifty, and he didn't look as put together as he normally did. The first thing he said to me was something along the lines of, "You're only 16, right?" To which I confirmed, and he continued with something like, "Well, when you're 18, I'll have something for you. It'll be a surprise, just wait till you're 18. And he promptly left through the bar section of the grill. I stood shocked for a moment before composing myself and finishing my cleaning, so I could get the hell out of there. After I finished counting my drawer down, I went out back and unlocked the bike that I had gotten a month or so after I started working there, and began to ride home. Note that I was paranoid as hell as I was doing this, because seriously, who the fuck says that to an underage girl? I watched my back all night as I rode home, and felt watched the entire time. It was kind of my fault he knew my age. I had told him a long time ago as I mentioned something about birthday plans. But his comment on my age made me feel sick to my stomach regardless. Now let's jump to more recently, when I started my new job, just across the parking lot. It's been years since I worked there, and I had just about let go of the memories of working at the godforsaken sports bar. But something happened recently that made the memories feel like yesterday. The stimulus checks and nice weather have brought a surge of customers to my current restaurant. I've worked here for almost a year now, and we have been busier in the past month than we've been since I first started. This means that occasionally I don't get to park right by the doors, and I must park a bit further away. On this particular day that still makes me feel nervous thinking about, I had to park basically at the farthest corner of our lot due to a large amount of staff and customers taking the closer spots. That day, I thought nothing of it as I went in for my closing shift and worked a long and stressful shift until about 10 p.m. I work at the front of the restaurant, and our closing duties can be pretty grueling. That night was especially bad because I was the only one up front beside the manager, who has to go back and forth between kitchen and front to help. I finished all of my cleaning, albeit a bit later than usual, and felt bad for taking so long, but they weren't too upset because a co-worker of mine was waiting on a ride, so they had to wait anyways. So with that, I say my goodbyes to the two of them and head out the back doors to my car. I immediately was irritated that I had to walk so far to get to my car, and I started digging for my keys. I didn't realize that there was a third car in our parking lot until it was almost too late. I finally grabbed my keys after a moment of struggling to find them and realized that the third car is in fact not my manager, and it was parked right next to mine. Although it did look similar, which is why I didn't think much of it at first, being exhausted from work. This is truly the scariest, most horrible thing that has ever happened to me. I have never been so petrified in my life. To this day, I still do not know who this man was, what he was trying to do, or if he still is where I saw him. I'm sorry for how long the geographical description is. I just want everyone to understand how secluded I was when this happened, and how badly it could have ended if it wasn't for my parents. I was back home for the summer for the first time in a year after starting uni. Our home was, still is, just outside of a small town with forests all around. There was also a small man-made lake, which was diverged from a river that ran for miles through the forest and ramified into a few streams east of the lake. Near my home, there was a small grassy path that led to the river following a stream. It was a long walk, but one I used to go on often as a child. I knew the forest there well. I knew where I could cut through dense trees to meet the stream. The walk I would go on always led me off the path, which turned northwest slowly, so away from the stream, and then took a sharp turn to the west after a few miles walk, at which point the stream was hidden quite deep into the forest. I'd continue to walk north and follow the stream through the forest to get to the river, then follow the river west to get to the lake. It's easy to get lost in this forest because the terrain isn't just a slope down to the water. It goes up and down, and you end up completely surrounded by trees. I'd spent many days wandering around there alone, or with my dad over the span of 18 years. Never saw anybody else in the forest. I went there twice that summer, both times alone-ish. The first time I left in the morning, I walked along the path away from the stream to the sharp bend, then cut back into the forest. I reached the stream after an hour or so. As I was running my hands in the water, I heard a bell from far away, coming from the north. Something was making a bell ring fervently and periodically, which I found strange. I listened well, wondered if it was a lost hunting dog, and started moving towards the sound. Why'ch I bloody know I'd be the first person to die, but I was heading north anyway, so what the hell. I realized it couldn't have been an animal. I could tell the bell was too heavy, because of how clear the sound was, to be on a collar. I kept moving and the bell was moving away from me. It stopped completely after 5 minutes. The stream wasn't big enough or strong enough to carry a bell. That could have been enclosed in a tin or something, and the river was too far still. I thought of everything, but nothing explained the sound, apart from one obvious thing, which I just didn't feel comfortable with for some reason. I knew it had to have been a person. I stopped thinking about it and just walked on normally, until I found a badger. A bloomin' dead one, carefully decapitated. It had obviously been done with a knife. It was fairly fresh, the body was still limp, and there wasn't too much smell coming from it. The wound was full of maggots, but I knew that happened soon after exposure. The sound of the bell had been following the stream, so had I. So the badger was put there, maybe killed there, at least decapitated, while I was walking that way, I suppose, to know really. Nothing else happened that day. 1 week later, I went back for the second time that summer, and the last time ever. I left home at around 6 p.m. I made it to the stream, then walked to the river in an hour, then decided to go back the way I came because it was getting late and it was raining quite heavily. The sun set at around 9 p.m. I was walking as fast as I could. The sound of the rain in the trees was surreal and loud. I was somewhat trotting with my head down for a while through the clearest and most open part of the forest when I bumped into something heavy. The smell was sickly. It was the decomposing body of the badger with his head strung to his front paws. That area looked a bit like a ham because of the way it was tied, just swinging from a tree, like an almost literal load of bollocks. It was this putrid bag of stench, wet and dripping green liquid. I started gagging. I had some sort of mucus-textured fluid in my hair. It was repulsive. At first I just stared at it, slightly gobsmacked. Then I started fidgeting violently because I felt like I was drenched in its juices. I was soaking from the rain. My senses became confused. It felt like a bucket of ice-cold water had been thrown over me when I realized that I walked the same way to get to the river. So someone had strung up the body up after I'd passed it on the way there. Someone knew I'd see it, so... Was someone watching me and running around the forest? Were the faint sounds of branches breaking around me not animals? I looked around and started jogging. I was half running, half walking away from the stream back towards the path for a while when I heard the bell again. I proceeded to call my dad while running. I told him to meet me on the path where it sharply turns west. It was the closest part of the path to me, to go as fast as he could, and that someone was in the forest. I can't explain the feeling I had. It was like I just SHT out my intestines and stomach. I literally felt the hairs on my neck raise despite being soaked. It was dark. I jogged as fast as I could. I was panicking because the path was still a bit far away, just too far to feel safe. It was still raining. Every single sound was muffled. I felt like everything was further away than ever before. The bell went on for way longer than the last time. On and off, I felt like it was surrounding me at one point. The fear combined with my compromised hearing, and the fact that I couldn't flip and breathe properly, was making me slightly lose my sense of direction. I was automatically heading southwest, but I wasn't really sure what I was even doing. I was breathing like a goddamn horse, coughing my lungs up, kind of crying out loud like a toddler does, tripping over leaves and twigs like an idiot. I stayed on the phone with my mom, who was on her way with my dad. I kept hearing sounds, but I wasn't sure what they were. My mom was screaming on the phone at the same time that they were on the path, that I needed to run, that my dad had gotten out and was heading east from the path bend. I was terrified, so I went into survival mode. I was doing the half-running, half-speed walking thing again, because I was out of breath. Then, I heard branches break, clear footsteps for the first time from down in the forest, and the bell ringing louder. I didn't want to, but I looked over my shoulder. That's when I saw what was in the forest with me. A tall figure creeping in my direction at the very end of the clearing, ringing this bell slowly in front of his stomach. I could tell he was staring straight at me. Now I don't know if I had a hidden secret sprinting ability, or instinctual adrenaline-induced superhuman powers, but when I tell you I ran for my life, I fucking didn't look back once. I screamed as much as I could. I lied. I'm on the phone with the police. They are on the path. Dad, I can see you. I'm here. I wanted to yell, Dad, please, where are you? But I kept that to myself. I felt like something awful was going to happen. I felt like the man was right behind me. I kept telling myself not to look back. I was gasping and wheezing, crying so hard and screaming for my dad. I felt shivers on my neck, and then switched off. I just ran. I even dropped my bag and only realized I didn't have it anymore when I was in the car. I felt like my phone was my only way home. Things no longer felt real. It was like my legs were moving by themselves. I didn't know if the man was still following me. I could only hear my heart beating in my ears and the bell. I finally heard my dad shout my name, and I knew he was coming my way, and that he could see me because of the intonation of his voice. I pretty much lunged myself at him when we got to each other. My dad heard the bell too. My mom could hear it on the phone. She was waiting with the car ready to leave fast.